Recently, we've seen the rhetoric of the elites getting a bit net zero skeptical. It's almost like some elections still have consequences. If you'd like to learn more about the environmental debate, you can go and subscribe to our website for as little as £5 a month. Help us keep the lights on, help us keep bringing excellent guests, and you'll get all of our premium content, like this discussion between myself, Josh, and Rory for Josh's Contemplations series about right-wing environmentalism, environmental traditionalism, and it's
Love me trees, love me hedgerows.
that was actually a debate that we
Simple
had
as.
finally on air.
Oh,
Yes.
really? Is that in?
Yes.
I'll have to tune in. I've been hearing this debate for the past 2 years in the office, so I want to see the formalized debate on air.
So I'm pro tree aesthetically, but pro hedgerow in terms of the ethic we should take with man living in correlation with nature.
Hedgerows are important.
Yes, they are. And Rory has an excellent and very eloquent elucidation of exactly why they're important and the tradition of hedgerow making and how it speaks to how man conceives of himself as a part of rather than above and mastering the environment. And that seems to be the ethic that we need to take going forward. Not everywhere in the world is standing reserve. And so it's a really philosophically rich discussion, actually, and it's not as much doom
Got me excited for it.
It's
now.
quite hopeful. So we'll go on to the first article. Rishi Sunak has decided that, there's an election coming up next year and my credibility is in the gutter. So I better start listening to some of my backbench MPs and throwing some red meat out to the base. He's granted about 100 new oil and gas licenses. Now, this sounds good, but we'll put it in the context of how many have been granted before, how many of them are likely to lead to reduction in energy costs. Things get a bit shaky.
I don't want to give too much credit to leftists, but I have seen some leftists posting about essentially his wife might be making a lot of money from these.
I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know what her business ventures would be related to this, but I wouldn't be shocked if she has stock in some of the energy companies. So he's issued 100 new North Sea oil and gas production licenses. Now, they're not for prospecting for new sites. These are just straight up for drilling. So they will be accessing sites that we already know have abundant oil in them. So that's good. It should be going into the market. The problem with the UK is that it's currently signed up to the global gas market, so we can't have this at a national price. So it's still going to be really costly and it won't bring down the wholesale price. We need to change the legislation on that. That would be sensible. The North Sea Transition Authority, which is responsible for issuing the licenses, said the majority of production permits issued do not end up with production actually taking place. So not all of these will lead to abundant energy production, according to the people that are going to be using it, which is frustrating, but baby steps at least. He's also funding the Acorn project in St. Fergus in Aberdeenshire, which is a joint venture between Shell and other companies to fund carbon capture in the northeast of Scotland. And it's going to take carbon, store it under the North Sea, which is also kind of self-defeating because what you would want to do is redisperse it in greenhouses for abundant crop growth or try and turn it into a material like Ian Crossland always goes on about on Timcast, which is graphene, which is more promising. But it just seems like at the moment with the current obsession with the climate crisis, they're like, any carbon, stick it under the ground. It's not like it has a useful purpose anyway. So they're going to be one of 4 projects getting £20 billion in funding between them. Sunak says, even when we reach net zero in 2050, about a quarter of our energy needs will still need to come from oil and gas, and domestic production has about a quarter or a third of the carbon footprint of imported gas. Now, that's very true. The Prime Minister said he made it absolutely no sense to import energy supplies with 2 to 3 times the carbon footprint of what we've got at home. Whereas Ed Miliband, who is the current, I think he's the Shadow Energy Environment Secretary for the Labour Party, former Labour leader, he said the Conservatives' energy policy had left Britain the worst hit country in Western Europe during the energy crisis. Well, you wanted to end energy manufacturing, Ed. You want to massively ramp up renewables, which are unaffordable and don't meet energy demands and will lead to blackouts, and then manufacture consent for energy restricting legislation. So you're not going to help, are you, mate?
Realistically, as a nation, you need energy independence.
Yes.
Or else, if any global crisis hits and supply chains get cut off, you are screwed and you are at the mercy of anybody who might want to take advantage of you. Because if you literally can't keep the lights on, what are you going to do?
Yeah, with renewables, both your energy sector and your population are quite literally exposed to the elements. And all of this worrying about global temperature increases, which the UK did not experience in apparently the hottest July on record around the world, some of which would have been exacerbated by all the arsonists starting wildfires, I'm sure. The UK...
Oh, and also that when they're measuring the temperatures, they're aiming them at airport runways and other such places.
Yeah, they've changed how they've actually recorded temperatures, not just with the technology, but with the different metrics that they're using. Especially pointing at a tarmac is a mad idea, but there you go.
Yes.
But in the UK, we suffer far more cold deaths than we do heat deaths every year. Bjorn Lomborg's written extensively about this. So actually, hotter weather and more accessible energy will save lives. But it's almost like they don't care about that.
Oh, it's brilliant. When you talk about the amount of heat deaths versus cold deaths each year, have you seen the way that they present the graphs?
Yes.
Where on the graphs, you'll have the two metrics laid out, one side heat deaths, one side cold deaths, for instance, and they'll look like they're about even. But then if you check the x-axis, you'll see that on cold deaths, it's into the thousands and thousands, and on heat deaths, it's in the tens.
Yes.
Just to make it look as though they're the same when it's actually very, very manipulative.
And Laura Dodsworth joked in her Great Brokenomics with Dan that came out earlier this week. You should go and watch that if you're a website subscriber. That the climate crisis is the next thing from COVID and Ukraine. It's the next current thing. And so soon we're going to start registering climate deaths as within 28 days of a hot day.
We've already started doing it a few years ago when people started having the cause of death down as climate change.
Yes, yeah,
so that's just seeding it. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we look more at the licenses, we've got a weird sequel to What is a Woman? That is, what is an oil and gas license? Thanks, BBC. There have been 33 licensing rounds since, with the latest beginning in October 2022. In the 32nd licensing round in 2020, 113 permits were awarded, while so far in the latest round, 115 applications have been made. So you can see the gradual ramping down of how many are getting approved and how many that companies are even investing in. Because, of course, most of the companies are signed up to ESG. Lots of the companies have had their board members displaced by activists over at BlackRock. And so not only are the governments legislating against energy security with fossil fuels, but lots of the fossil fuel companies are now divesting into renewables. So both the public and private sector are both on board with making us colder and poorer. So it peaked in the late 1990s until something happened and has declined ever since. In 2000, production was nearly 250 million tons of oil equivalent. In 2022, it was 80 million tons. To date, more than 48 million barrels of oil and gas have been extracted from UK waters. It is thought there are only 4 billion barrels left. Now, I'm going to go on to this piece from a little while ago and do some fact checking.
All right.
Because Rishi Sunak has had MPs whispering in his ear for quite some time, and lords like David Frost, who spearheaded the Brexit movement, that said, well, you really need to get cracking on oil and gas because the BBC are just lying. It's not 4 billion. Actually, government estimates say there are about 10 to 20 billion barrels still in the North Sea. And if we use just 10% of what we've got in the North Sea, then it's going to keep us energy independent for 50 years. So this seems like a no-brainer. So they're only doing this, they're only ramping down the scale
and 50
deliberately
years,
immiserate us.
Yeah, and 50 years sounds like a great grace period that we would have to be able to build all of the nuclear power stations that we would need to keep us independent on energy forever.
Yes, and also be net energy exporters like France, who
and
earn
also
billions every year from sending it abroad.
And also hopefully to train up the sorts of people who will be competent enough to run those power stations properly, because I believe in some parts of Cheshire and Greater Manchester, they are starting to develop some power stations, or at least nuclear energy around that area. But at the moment, with the skills and competency crisis, I am a little bit hesitant, if I'm perfectly honest, about who will be manning these stations. Although, fingers crossed.
We're also joint venturing 2 of our current nuclear power stations with Chinese General Nuclear, and we're investing 500 million in a joint project between the Chinese government and us on UK soil. So presumably there's going to be Chinese workers coming over and working on this project, which means they can just steal our state nuclear secrets. What a stupid idea. I tried to reform the funding on this. They accepted it, and yet things aren't happening. So I did my best, guys.
Keep those visas rolling, boys.
Yeah. But let's play a game. About all this, so Rishi Sunak, not
Skyrim.
It would be fun. Politics of Skyrim is coming at some point. No promises. Maybe November. Anyway, point being, back to the climate. Rishi Sunak, not our guy, not doing what we want. But The Guardian are upset, of course, because he's not left-wing enough. He's not alarmist enough. So let's play a game. Who's the most alarmist out of these 2 Guardian columns, redundantly on the same topic?
All right, okay, go for it.
First candidate, George Monbiot, our resident midwit who says all farming needs to end.
He's that guy.
Yes. So George Monbiot, here's the truth about Sunak's plans for the North Sea. He will sell out the planet to the dirtiest bidders. Let's read the opening paragraph. To understand this moment, we have to recognize that there is an existential struggle on both sides. While environmental scientists and activists fight for the very survival of the habitable planet, the fossil fuel, meat, and internal combustion industries are fighting for their economic survival. Either they are regulated out of existence, or human society across much of the world will fail. We cannot all win. Either these industries survive, or we do. but we can all lose because eventually they will go down with the rest of us.
Okay, so either everybody becomes a soy boy pod person, and
Like George Monbiot.
like George Monbiot. Scroll back up so we can see the
Very dysgenic, yes.
yes, the physiognomy there is not strong, very distrustworthy. Um, or the planet explodes.
Yes.
The core just fails entirely, and the sun
We're Krypton.
crashes into us. Yeah, just out of nowhere, just boom. One day you're just walking about your day, probably tucking into a nice juicy steak, and then you're dead.
I mean, as far as ways to go, I mean, there are worse.
Yeah, there's worse.
There's being George Monbiot for a lifetime. To buy himself a few more months of political survival, Rishi Sunak, representing a party that's recently taken 3.5 million from major polluters and climate deniers, that's the Global Warming Policy Foundation, by the way, who I've written for before, that says the world isn't going to burn and we're spending too much money on bad climate policy. Climate denier!
Climate denier in this context means somebody who recognizes that the climate can change and is changing, but just doesn't want to say exactly if the world will explode.
Yeah, and doesn't want to eradicate all of human activity because you're not a delusional genocidal misanthrope. He is threatening the welfare of the human species. He has switched over the past fortnight from doing a grand total of nothing to prevent the climate chaos. Trillions of dollars pledged to Pakistan is nothing, really? I mean, I wish he did nothing, seriously. To actively sabotaging both the climate programs he inherited and the efforts of other public bodies. It's actively sabotaging to repatriate energy production, even though the cost is still not going to come down, and use liquid natural gas rather than the higher emissions imports from overseas. Like, Monbiot at this point is either so stupid as to not know his solutions don't work, or he's deliberately lying to kill people. Because that's what's going to happen.
I wish the Tories were as based as The Guardian thinks they are.
Oh, would you like to parallel this with the delusional dreams
with the next one, go on.
of The Guardian's lead crazy person, Zoe Williams?
Yes.
Rishi Sunak's contempt for the climate shows us just how right-wing he really is. I so wish he was even remotely right-wing. But he isn't.
Also, right-wingers, as we prove in the Contemplations you promoted at the beginning of this, love the environment.
Well, okay, so actual right-wingers do. We criticize a lot of the current right-wing and even the policy sphere that I used to come from, because the current delineations are either the Just Stop Oil, Greta Thunberg, how dare you, the world is burning down style apocalypse vision, which means that we need to eradicate all human activity off the planet because we are the carbon they want to reduce. Or it's the right accepting all of the frame of the terms of debate, but just saying we can Francis Bacon style innovate, engineer, and manipulate nature out of it. And what Rory, Josh, and I were saying is that by both of those approaches, we have ultimately alienated ourselves from nature and either turned it into a religious body that's above us in the first one, or something to be manipulated and taken from Amazon rainforest to Amazon warehouse product on a shelf. And that means that we are going to we're going to feel dislocated from time and place. And tradition cannot survive under those conditions. So what you need actually is to create technologies that rescind the amount of space that human beings take up on the planet, while also clearing up the energy that we produce and allowing us to reintegrate with nature on both an emotional and physical level. So we can get back to time, place, parochial culture. But neither of these people want to do that. And Rishi Sunak certainly doesn't want to do it because he's a managerial technocrat.
No, of course. I'm just going to go even simpler than what you were just saying there and just say that as an Englishman, walking through an ancient forest or traveling around some beautiful fields or climbing a hill just so that I can look at the view speaks to me spiritually. It resonates with the vibrations of my bones. And so if I were unable to do something like that, I would be deeply distressed for the rest of my life.
That's the transcendentalist philosophy we actually go through in our contemplations. What we need to do, though, is we need to take one step further than that, because that only existed because of the Industrial Revolution, because you had a clear cleave between the woodland that was regenerating, because you no longer needed to cut down wood to burn fires when you had coal and gas, and the stifling cities that people wanted to escape, because they literally felt so polluted that they thought, as the eye is the window to the soul, if all I'm looking at is concrete and smog all the time, I need to get back out to the wilderness to cleanse myself. And so Ralph Waldo Emerson believed that if you looked at nature, it would repeal the mean egoism of being and connect you to the objective undercurrents of the world, capital B being. And that's what you're articulating there. It's the painting of the wanderer standing atop the hillside and looking over at the clouds.
It's a great painting.
Yeah, that's what we need to reconnect with, but we need to see ourselves as not above it, but alongside it. And Rishi Sunak doesn't see that. But
Rishi Sunak's not from here. Why
Yeah.
would he feel any connection to the green and pleasant land of England?
He's an anywhere man of finance. He just doesn't feel the same about the country as we do. Zoe Williams, though, thinks he's right wing. This is one of the maddest sentences I've read. I had a premonition that Rishi Sunak was about to do something deeply ungreen.
Source, it came to me in a dream.
Quite literally. I didn't know exactly what, and definitely couldn't have named which oil and gas licenses he wanted to issue, but I knew that whatever it would spell the end of our commitment to net zero. Please.
So, sorry. Literally, this is, it came to me in a dream. Yep. I had a bad dream about Rishi Sunak, and now I know he's going to destroy the planet.
She's Batman in Justice League.
I'm sorry, I hate George Monboyard, however he pronounces his name, French
Bon
name.
Voyage, yep.
Yeah, French name, don't care, opinion discarded. But this is crazier from the first sentence.
Yep.
My God.
I've read the ecological tea leaves, and it says that the planet's going to be set ablaze. I figured it would shift our international alignment away from the countries taking the climate crisis seriously, because it's right in front of them, and they are not psychopaths, towards the countries strutting their indifference to it, with a complicated but demonstrable political mileage in the message, follow me to hell, it'll be fun there. It's possible that this guy steering our country in its hard right direction is actually quite right-wing. Again, I wish. And so the delusion posting is not endearing me to Rishi Sunak, but I am enjoying how upset they are. And this screaming is obviously helping put more and more people in the British public off net zero because they realize the cost of it. They realize that they're going to outlaw cars and boilers and lock you in 15-minute cities and make you eat the bugs. And ahead of the next election, the rhetoric is shifting because if people are getting agitated about how much it's going to cost them, then the very utilitarian Tories are going to make the gambit and change the rhetoric, not the commitment to a lot of the legislation, of course, because Grant Shapps is currently bankrolling renewables to the billions, and he was the one that told Sadiq Khan to expand ULEZ in the first place. The Uniparty is very much real. But Michael Gove, who pulls a lot of the strings for the Tory party behind the scenes, he knows where all the bodies are buried, and he's a very untrustworthy fellow, I'll put it that way. He has turned around and said in an interview with The Telegraph that the Dutch protests over emissions regulations show the inflexible application of rules designed to reduce pollution leads to a backlash. Also, Sir Ian Duncan-Smith has become the latest MP to call for a rethink of net zero in light of the by-election results. And Sir Ian Duncan-Smith used to lead the Conservative Party. He wrote in The Telegraph...
Ian Duncan-Smith, isn't he the one that sponsored the policy exchange document that was talking about letting Afghans into your home? Or was that another traitorous slime that works for the Tories?
I don't know if that was him. I know he's very anti-China and he was very anti-lockdown. So he's sometimes okay. But if that was him, then that's very frustrating.
I don't think it was, but his name does ring a bell somewhere.
He said that the target of reducing greenhouse emissions to zero by 2050 has led to arbitrary and very costly deadlines such as the 2030 ban on the sale of petrol and diesel cars, with absolutely no plan on how you're going to replace the low-capacity car charging ports for electric cars in London because they just want you off the road.
Yeah, there's no practical justification or application for such a harebrained scheme.
No, so it's just behavioural nudge to make you only take public transport and use the CBDC. And if you tweet the wrong thing, well, I guess you're walking everywhere forever.
I'm going to sound like Josh when I say this, but I don't want to have to take public transport and sit next to smelly proles all day.
I don't really blame you. I mean, my commute is hell. And speaking of commuting through London, there was a recent by-election.
Except for you, viewer, watching this right now. I love you. I would love to sit next to you on public transport and shake your hand.
I actually did that the other day on Tuesday when I came in early. There was a guy who was on the Elizabeth line standing next to me, and he just prodded me because I had my earphones, and he went, are you from the podcast? And I just went, yeah. He went, oh, I love it, mate. I'll let you get back to it.
Oh, that's nice. It is honestly very nice to...
We do like street viewer interactions. They happen far more than we expect, and they're really heartwarming. What isn't heartwarming is the Conservatives recently won a by-election victory by the narrowest of margins because the Conservative candidate ran on a wholly anti-ULEZ platform. Now, ULEZ, for those that don't know, is the ultra-low emission zone, which was, again, sponsored by one of the Conservative Party MPs, who was the Transport Minister, and now I can't remember what he does, but he's something to do with net zero. Grant Shapps. Totally useless, man. Sadiq Khan decided to expand the £12.50 per day penalty tax on cars, I think that are older than 6 years, and also run on diesel, to all of London, including Greater London boroughs. So that includes my borough. So basically, my dad can't drive now. Thanks, Sadiq. Because he did that, the Conservative Party candidate, Steve Tuckwell, he said, if I get in Boris Johnson's old seat, because Boris got kicked out of the Conservative Party, I will make sure that ULEZ never comes to Uxbridge and Ruislip. And he won by 13,965 votes to Labour's Danny Boy Beale's 13,470. So a very narrow majority of, 495? Bear in mind, Boris Johnson won the constituency back in 2019 with a majority of 7,210. That's on top of his opponent. So that's a total blowout. So, one, I don't like Boris, but lots of people did, and they felt that throwing him out of the Conservative Party was treachery. But number two, it just shows the Conservatives are so unpopular that actually just rallying against net zero is the only reason they can win, even though they're passing it anyway.
Well, even from what you're saying there from the Conservative perspective, from the Labour perspective, ULEZ in London is such a stupid idea.
Yep.
If you're playing the game of politics, you need to play the game where you offer people things where they will vote for you. That's what you do. If you're offering something that will kneecap them and make it more expensive for them to go about your day-to-day life, it is such an obvious policy loss, such an obvious losing tactic that they are going to eventually have to step back away from it if they want to continue winning elections.
Yes, and so the candidate who would be nice to get an interview with, actually, at some point. She follows him on Twitter, so maybe. Stay tuned. Susan Hall, she's running entirely on an anti-ULEZ ticket in 2024 to displace Sadiq Khan as well. Starmer is quaking in his boots, and he said something is very wrong when a party policy was on each and every Tory leaflet. Now, Starmer is
such a clear win.
Yeah, he's a big backer of net zero. He said that, again, he prefers Davos to Westminster, so he's fully signed up to the WEF abolish all emissions agenda. But which worm tongue was in his ear telling him that net zero might not be the best idea? The unflushable turd returns. Tony Blair. He gave an interview in the New Statesman to Andrew Marr, very unbiased BBC, of course, about a week before the by-election. And he said, if I was back in frontline politics, at one point in the conversation, Andrew Marr argued that climate change is a bigger issue than AI. Blair's been banging on about AI. The World Economic Forum is leading the UK's AI legislation. Blair is very involved in the WEF to the point of where he might even succeed Klaus Schwab. All makes sense. Narrative is harmonizing.
I would be impressed if Klaus Schwab, and I mean this seriously, if he had more global influence overall than Tony Blair does.
Yes,
because Tony Blair, with the Tony Blair Institute, has fingers in so many pies all across the world, it's untrue.
Yes, so he's going to turn that gigantic squid with its tendrils everywhere into a Cthulhu that swims ceaselessly left, I think, if he does become arch nemesis to us all by being head of Davos. And he says, it's the single biggest global challenge, right? And Britain should play its part in that, addressing climate change. But its part, frankly, is going to be less to do with Britain's emissions. I mean, 1 month's rise in China's emissions would outscore the whole of Britain's emissions for a year. That's you'd hear that opinion on Talk TV. You would.
Okay, right.
If anyone listened to it.
I'm gonna say this now, and don't take this as an endorsement, okay? I think that Tony Blair, purely in terms of being a practical man who gets things done and knows how to get things done, is actually substantially to the right of the Tories at this point, at least in terms of how he is advising Keir Starmer in his rhetoric. Obviously, we can't trust him, but when it comes to the rhetoric and what he's advising Keir Starmer to do, and what Keir Starmer is doing as a result of that advice, is to the right of what the Tories are preaching these days.
I actually think if Tony Blair were in power, in the age of the internet and dissent, we would actually be able to be more effective at outmaneuvering him and creating a proper counter right wing that wasn't contained by the Tory frontbench than if the current Conservatives were in power.
I just want the Tories to implode as a party.
I want them to be a state in which they are capturable, because we are results-based people, and I do know people that are working diligently on the inside with relative levels of success. And I will be going
best luck to them, but I want the Tories just to be swept away.
Yes, I'll be going to a party conference again this year, and I will gauge the mood and try not to get arrested this time. And so we come to the position now where Keir Starmer has listened to Tony Blair, and he was up on stage at a Tony Blair Institute for Global Change event in Westminster a little while ago.
That header image is amazing.
Yes. Genuinely meeting his hero.
And then I told them they had weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
So Blair said, and this is a great line, Labour leaders were always in receipt of an inexhaustible supply of advice on how to lose an election. So he is seeing that Starmer, with the woman question, which has now been addressed as adult human female, and the climate change question, which is maybe don't go full net zero too quickly because people won't vote for you. Blair is realizing that Starmer may be able to snatch defeat from the jaws of almost certain victory here because the Conservatives are imploding. And so I'm not saying they're abandoning net zero. They're not. But the
They might
rhetoric
just
is
be saying that they do,
yes,
and then turn around and do whatever they want when they're in power anyway.
yes, but the rhetoric is shifting. So this is at least a moment that allows us to crowbar public discontent with how expensive and illogical the policies are. So keep hammering, and we might be able to do something about it.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content that's on the site, such as this symposium episode, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics Part 1. If you'd like to find out what else is being put out, you can follow on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.